We now look at chapter 10, Paul's letters from prison. They will include Philemon, Colossians, Ephesians, and Philippians. At the end of this assignment, you'll be able to 1. Describe the occasion for Paul's letter to Philemon and to the Colossians, then Ephesians and Philippians, and place them in the context of Paul's ministry. Secondly, summarize the major themes and theological points made by Paul in his letter from prison. Thirdly, as an application objective, apply to your own life and ministry what these letters say, both about the person and work of Jesus Christ and way of exhortation for living the Christian life. Paul was imprisoned at least twice more in Caesarea and then in Rome. We realize that Paul wrote the prison letters between 60 and 62 AD. He sent letters in the midst of hardships to encourage, rebuke, and instruct the believers in the churches in Macedonia and Asia Minor. Paul calls himself an ambassador in chains as he continued to preach the gospel even when he was in prison. Colossians and Ephesians are regarded companion letters or pieces, in which case the themes of the two letters complement each other. In Colossians, Paul says that Christ is the head of all things, while in Ephesians, he calls him the head of the church. Scholars speculate that they were the sample of friendly letters with the messages addressed to church communities, which gave Paul both concern and joy. Paul, a prisoner of Christ. Although Paul is in prison, his spirit is never fettered, and he maintains his uttermost confidence in the victory won for him and for us in Christ Jesus. Besides Paul being a passionate theologian, he is also a pastor. Readers even today are instructed, rebuked, and encouraged by Paul's words. Paul had written situation-specific ethical passages which incorporate portions of what scholars think to be al-hymns. These make points which can be remembered because of the rhythmic familiarity. As an example, so here we begin by looking at Philemon in outline. It begins with greetings, thanksgiving and prayer, a plea on behalf of Onesimus, then closing. Things we need to know before. The purpose of this letter was to convince Philemon to forgive his runaway slave, Onesimus, and to accept him as a brother in the faith. And this correlates with what St. Luke says, that when we are believers in Christ, we regard each other as brother and sister, regardless of our social status or economic. Paul is believed to have written this letter about AD 60 during his imprisonment in Rome. This letter was written to Philemon, who was probably a wealthy member of the Colossian church. Slavery was very common in the Roman Empire, and evidently some Christians had slaves. Paul does not condemn the institution of slavery in his writings, but he makes a radical statement by calling this slave, Philemon, Philemon's brother in Christ. And you can understand the difference that lies between the master and the slave. But now, because they are both Christians, he calls Onesimus a brother to Philemon, his boss or his master. Philemon and his house church lived in Colossae, about 100 miles east of Ephesus in Asia Minor. 3 themes were discussed here: forgiveness, barriers, and respect. Forgiveness. Philemon was Paul's friend and the legal owner of the slave Onesimus. However, Paul humbly asked Philemon not to punish Onesimus, but forgive and restore him as a new Christian brother, although he had all the rights to punish him. Slaves were known to be people who would not claim personal rights. Therefore, the masters would treat them in any way they wanted. They were legally owned, and therefore they would not claim any rights if they were denied. Onesimus, having run away, as it said, his master must have been disappointed. But since Paul was an acquaintance to both, he preached to Onesimus, and Onesimus accepted Jesus Christ and became a believer, and now he's being sent back to his master. And Paul is writing a letter requesting his master not to be furious and punish Onesimus. It is known that if a slave ran away from the master and was captured, brought back to the master can kill or can do anything he wanted. And even some prisoners were known to be cut off their ears as a sign of being slaves, but also a sign of punishment. So he's writing back that Philemon should receive Onesimus and restore him, this time not as an ordinary slave, but a Christian slave. Christian relationship must be full of forgiveness and acceptance. Do you find it easy to forgive those who wrong you? Sometimes when I ask this question, you hear some people saying, yes, forgiving. You can forgive, but do you find it easy? Sometimes we are struggling. How do I forgive somebody who has done such a grave mistake against me, and so on? But being a Christian, you have to seek for a way how you can forgive and forget. There are some people who say, I will forget, but I will not forget. I will forgive, but not forget. If you forgive and not forget, then that is not forgiving, because it will remain in your heart. It will be hurting. So better forgive and forget, and you move on smoothly. Barriers. Slavery was widespread in the Roman Empire, but no one is lost to God or beyond his love. Slavery was a barrier between people, but Christian love and fellowship had overcome such barriers. You can think about those people who work in our families, like maids and houseboys. How do we treat them? How do we accord them this kind of respect as human beings? Sometimes you find that we disregard their status as humans, and we look at the work they are doing. Work does not define humanity. It is humanity that defines the work we do. In Christ, we are one family. No walls of racial or economic or political differences should separate us. Let Christ work through you to remove barriers between Christian brothers and sisters. Paul was a friend of both Philemon and Onesimus. He had the authority as an apostle to tell Philemon from a Christian point of view what to do. Yet, Paul chose to appeal to his friend in Christian love rather than to order him what to do. In this case, we say tactful persuasion accomplishes a great deal more than commands when we are dealing with people. Remember to exhibit courtesy and respect to your relationships. Some people think that positions are above humanity. We are today, tomorrow we may not be in those positions. But regarding fellow human beings in spite of those positions is very important. So Paul is writing to Philemon, begging him, not forcing him to accept Onesimus. So we have to be tactful the way how we deal with other human beings, especially when they are having a higher status. Life has many walls and fences that divide and separate and compartmentalize, not made of wood and stone, but are personal obstructions blocking people from each other and from God. But Christ came as the legal wall remover, tearing down the sin partitions that separates us from God and blasting the barriers that keep us from each other. And sincerely, this helps us because we know at our workplaces we have obstructions of status, obstructions of payments, obstructions of hatred, jealousy, and all these. But when you have Jesus Christ in you, He removes them. You come to learn that each one is given assignments according to his or her calling and according to the skills and talents you have been given. You cannot be the same, you cannot be like others. You have your own, even when you are holding the same position. Like I am a human resource here, another one is a human resource somewhere. Our organizations are different. I'm a lecturer, I'm lecturing in a different area. We might be two lecturers lecturing in the same subject, but we have different approaches, different examples, and therefore we cannot be the same. But envy always comes when one is liked and the other one is not liked. Can't say he's hated, but is not liked. So those obstructions can be dealt with if we allow Jesus Christ to come and remove those walls. Roman, Greek, and Jewish cultures were littered with barriers. A society assigned people to classes and expected them to stay in their places. Men, be where you are. Women, be where you are supposed to be. Slaves and free. Rich and poor. Jews and Gentiles. Greek and barbarians. Pious and pagan. So, if you are in this category, you should then not cross over to the other category. There is always marginalization of the other. So that was the culture of the time. But with the message of Christ, these walls of racialism, walls of tribalism, walls of any other kind you can think about, came down. And that's where Paul declares that in this new life, it does not matter if you are a Jew or a Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbaric, uncivilized, slave or free. Christ is all that matters, as He lives in all of us. So we have a key verse to guide us. In Philemon chapter 1 verse 15, Paul says, perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back for good, no longer a slave, better than a slave, as a dear brother. Sometimes we may find certain things happen which appear to be negative, but the end result becomes positive for one reason or the other. Onesimus is running away was to be confronted with the gospel of salvation, and now he's being sent back to Philemon as a saved slave, and more than a slave. So sometimes we should accept what takes place in our lives which appear to be negative, but the end result might be promising and fruitful. Colossians. It is believed that Paul may never have been to Colossae. The church at Colossae is thought to have been founded by Epaphras, one of Paul's converts from Ephesus. You read Philemon verse 23 and Colossians chapter 4 verse 11. Scholars think that Epaphras visited Paul in Rome in hope that Paul would help refute the theological differences beginning to tear the Colossian community of Christians apart. This visit therefore resulted in 1. A theological explanation of just who Jesus is, and 2. An exhortation guiding Christians' behavior or Christians' life. Colossians in outline. Jesus Christ, image of the invisible God. Jesus Christ, the ministry of God. Rules of Christian living, and final personal greetings. Things we need to know. The purpose of this letter was to combat errors in the church and to show that believers have everything they need in Christ. Paul wrote this letter to the church at Colossae, a city in Asia Minor. It was written about AD 60 during Paul's imprisonment in Rome. Paul had never visited Colossae. Evidently, the church had been founded by Epaphras and other converts from Paul's missionary travels. The church, however, has been infiltrated by religious relativism, with some believers attempting to combine elements of paganism and secular philosophy with Christian doctrine, which sometimes we would call syncretism. Paul confronts these teachings and affirms the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. So he deals with the following themes. Christ is God. Christ is the head of the church. Union with Christ. Then heresy. Christ is God. Jesus Christ is God in the flesh, Lord of all creation and Lord of the new creation. He is the visible image of the invisible God, which takes us to the point of incarnation. He is eternal, pre-existent, omnipotent, equal with the Father. He is supreme and complete. Because Christ is supreme, our lives must be Christ-centered. To recognize Him as God means to regard our relationship with Him as most vital and to make His interest our top priority. When we talk about something supreme, something ideal, something super, that's what we look for. So if Christ is supreme, why can't we take Him as the central part of our living and recognize Him as a means to show us God's ways and take His interests a priority?